You know, the most notorious gangster of the Prohibition era once ran a soup kitchen. You might also be surprised that President Franklin Roosevelt briefly rode in Al Capone's bulletproof car after Pearl Harbor because the government had seized it. Well, today we're going to unpack the life of Alphonse Al Capone, an immigrant kid from Brooklyn who became America's public enemy #1, built a multi-million-dollar bootlegging empire, and was ultimately taken down not by bullets, but by the Internal Revenue Service. This 15 to 17-minute journey covers Capone's early life, rise to power, notorious violence, philanthropic gestures, conviction, and decline. We'll sprinkle in lesser-known facts and human quirks along the way. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born in Brooklyn, New York, on January 17, 1899, to Italian immigrant parents. Actually, his parents Gabriel, a barber, and Teresa had come to America in the 1890s, and young Al was the fourth of 9 children. You know, he grew up in a working-class, mostly Italian neighborhood, where petty crime and gang culture were common. He briefly attended school, but after hitting a teacher, he was expelled in the 6th grade at age 14. Without much formal education, he took menial jobs: candy store clerk, bowling alley pin boy, and bookbindery cutter, while drifting towards street gangs. Actually, as a teenager, Capone joined the 5 Points Gang, an Italian-American gang in Manhattan renowned for breeding organized crime talent. He also spent time with Brooklyn Rippers and 40 Thieves Juniors. Well, the nickname Scarface came from a barroom knife fight. After he hit on a woman, her brother slashed his left cheek. Later, embarrassed by the scars, he told people they came from a wartime injury and hated being called Scarface. Friends called him Big Al, or Snorky, to reference his sharp dress. Alright, so while working as a bouncer for gangster Frankie Yale in Brooklyn, Capone impressed Johnny Torrio, an Italian mobster who ran a network of brothels and gambling dens. Actually, in 1920, Torrio invited Capone to join him in Chicago and help manage Big Jim Colosimo's rackets. Well, Torrio needed muscle and a trusted lieutenant because Prohibition, which began in 1920, had created a lucrative market for illegal alcohol. Capone accepted, moving his young wife May and their infant son Albert Sonny to Chicago. Big Jim Colosimo refused to embrace bootlegging, preferring prostitution and gambling. In May 1920, Colosimo was shot to death. Many historians believe Torrio arranged the murder to make way for bootlegging. Well, Torrio and Capone then expanded into the illegal liquor business, using bribery and violence to carve out territory. They operated out of the Hawthorne Inn in Cicero, fitting it with bulletproof shutters and employing a private army of about 500 men. Their empire controlled breweries, speakeasies, brothels, and gambling dens across Chicago and its suburbs, generating an estimated $105 million in annual revenue by 1928. That's over $1.5 billion in today's dollars. According to later estimates, Capone's net worth reached $100 million by 1927. In January 1925, Torrio was ambushed by rival gunmen and seriously wounded. He decided to retire to Italy and handed control of the Chicago outfit to Capone, then 26 years old. Actually, Capone's combination of charm and brutality helped him maintain discipline. He cultivated politicians such as Mayor William Hale Thompson, who issued cards instructing police to extend courtesies to Capone's men. Meanwhile, he smoothed his public image. He donated to charities, sponsored a soup kitchen that fed hundreds during the Great Depression, and ordered expensive floral arrangements for victims' funerals. Well, he even insisted to reporters that he provided light pleasures and was doing a public service. Behind that benevolent facade was ruthless violence. Capone's gang battled the North Side Gang led by George Bugs Moran over control of Chicago's bootleg beer market. This period, sometimes called the Beer Wars, killed hundreds. Capone personally directed hits on rivals, including using a baseball bat to beat 3 former associates to death. Well, his men used drive-by shootings with machine guns. One early raid in April 1925 killed State's Attorney Bill McSwiggan, causing public outrage. Capone became famous for his bulletproof Cadillac, which had armored glass and weighed over 7,000 pounds. After the Treasury Department seized it in 1932, the Secret Service used it as an emergency armored car for President Franklin Roosevelt immediately after Pearl Harbor. Actually, Capone also bought a Miami mansion under the alias Albert Costa and kept a fleet of custom suits and diamond-studded accessories. He enjoyed jazz music, tipping musicians generously. Some anecdotes say his men once kidnapped pianist Fats Waller and forced him to play at Capone's birthday party, paying him $100 per song. Historians point point out there is little hard evidence for the Waller kidnapping, but it reflects Capone's larger-than-life legend. Well, Capone also loved music himself. While imprisoned at Alcatraz, he played banjo and guitar in a prison band called the Rock Islanders. Actually, one forgotten twist in Capone's family is his elder brother Vincenzo Capone, who fled the family after injuring someone in a gang fight. He reinvented himself as Richard Two-Gun Hart, adopted cowboy attire, and became a federal prohibition agent in Nebraska. Hart enforced the very laws his brothers were breaking, unaware of their growing infamy until newspapers splashed Al Capone across headlines. In later life, after Capone's release from prison, the brothers briefly reconnected. Well, this contrast underscores how one immigrant family produced both a notorious gangster and a U.S. lawman. The most infamous episode of Capone's reign was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang awaited a truckload of whiskey in a North Side garage. 4 gunmen, including 2 dressed as police officers, ordered them to line up against a wall and then fired around 70 rounds from Thompson submachine guns, killing all 7. The victims included Peter and Frank Gusenberg, Albert Kachelik, John May, Reinhard Schwimmer, James Clark, and Adam Heyer. Actually, Capone was in Florida at the time, ostensibly to establish an alibi, but most historians believe he ordered the hit to eliminate Moran and assert dominance. Public outrage surged, and Chicago business leaders demanded a crackdown on gang violence. However, prosecutors still lacked evidence to charge Capone directly. Well, Capone's downfall began not with murder charges, but with lesser offenses. In 1929, federal agents subpoenaed him to testify before a grand jury. He skipped court, claiming he was sick, but investigators caught him betting at horse races and gambling in the Bahamas. A judge held him in contempt of court, and he was briefly jailed. Actually, later that year, he was arrested for concealed weapons in Philadelphia and sentenced to 1 year at Eastern State Penitentiary, where he used his wealth to furnish his cell with rugs, a radio, and fine furniture. After release, he returned to Chicago as violence escalated. You know, while Chicago police struggled to prosecute Capone for murder, the federal government pursued a novel strategy: tax evasion. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in U.S. v. Sullivan that income earned from illegal liquor could be taxed. Soon after, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon instructed the Internal Revenue Bureau to get Capone. Agent Frank Wilson and the T-Men combed through hotel bills, jewelry receipts, and telephone records to prove he had substantial unreported income. They found evidence of lavish spending, but no bank accounts or checks signed by Capone. Actually, in 1931, Capone's attorneys negotiated a plea bargain for a 2-year sentence on income tax charges. However, Judge James Wilkerson refused to accept the deal and changed the jury at the last minute to prevent jury tampering. Capone then pleaded not guilty. Over the course of the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Capone owed $215,000 in back taxes on $1,038,654 of income. Witnesses included employees who kept ledgers and a waiter who testified about Capone paying cash for thousands of dollars in meals. Well, the jury convicted him on 5 counts of tax evasion, and the judge sentenced him on October 24, 1931, to 11 years in federal prison, fined him $50,000, and ordered him to pay back taxes and court costs. It was the harshest sentence ever for tax evasion at that time. You know, Capone began serving his sentence at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. There, he continued to bribe officials, obtaining special luxuries such as a reading chair and mirror. In 1934, Warden James A. Johnston transferred him to Alcatraz, a new maximum security prison meant to break gangland influence. At Alcatraz, he became inmate AZ-85, lost contact with his empire, and spent his days doing laundry. When he arrogantly told the warden, "You know who I am," Johnston reportedly replied, "Here you are now known as AZ-85. Capone later admitted, "It looks like Alcatraz has got me licked." Actually, Capone's health had been deteriorating for years. He contracted syphilis while working in Colosimo's brothels, and, ashamed, never sought early treatment. By the mid-1930s, he showed signs of paresis, a form of neurosyphilis that damages the brain. In February 1938, doctors diagnosed him with syphilis of the brain, and he was confined to the prison hospital. Well, he also suffered from cocaine withdrawal. Years of snorting the drug had perforated his nasal septum. In 1938, inmate James Lucas attacked Capone with scissors, further injuring him. Released from Alcatraz in 1939 for medical reasons after serving about 7 years, Capone spent a year in a Baltimore hospital and then retired to his Palm Island estate in Florida. A physician later concluded his mental capacity was that of a 12-year-old child. He sometimes conversed with imaginary past associates. After his release, Capone mostly kept out of the public eye. He enjoyed fishing and playing banjo at home. In 1946, his physician and a Baltimore psychiatrist declared him incompetent to stand trial for any pending charges, citing his severe dementia. He suffered a stroke on January 21, 1947, then pneumonia, and died of a heart attack on January 25, 1947 at age 48. Actually, he was buried at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. Later, his remains were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery. In the end, Capone's mythologized story hides a more nuanced history of prohibition, corruption, and human contradiction. In 2 minutes, we'll debunk movie myths, highlight the societal impact of his empire, and reflect on the lessons learned. Well, Al Capone's legend owes as much to Hollywood as to history. The famous baseball bat dinner massacre is mostly fiction. He only used a bat a few times. Stories of Agent Elliot Ness leading the charge are overblown. It was tax investigators and a tough judge who put him away. Even the St. Valentine's Day massacre was never solved, yet Capone remains forever linked to it. Actually, his life shows how Prohibition created a lucrative black market, turning neighborhood toughs into multi-millionaires and exposing deep corruption in politics and policing. The bootlegging wars shocked America and taught federal agents that following the money can be more effective than chasing gunmen. Capone's conviction made clear that income from illegal sources is taxable, and that tax evasion is a powerful tool against organized crime. You know, he could order murders yet still run a soup kitchen and dote on his family. His brother, Two Gun Hart, enforced prohibition laws. His bulletproof car later ferried President Roosevelt, and he quietly bought Florida property under the alias Albert Costa. Untreated syphilis eventually ravaged his mind, leaving him childlike in his final years. Well, stripped of myth, Capone's story is a cautionary tale about greed and hubris. A Brooklyn immigrant built a criminal empire during Prohibition, basked in fame and brutality, and was finally undone by the IRS. It's a reminder that economic policies can have unintended consequences, and that no one, even public enemy number one, is above the law. Capone didn't die in a hail of bullets. He died quietly, diminished by disease, far from the streets he once ruled.